Hey guys, Jean Charest says Canada will eventually thank U.S. President Donald Trump for providing the country with a much-needed economic shakeup. The Quebec premier between 2003 and 2012 told business leaders in Quebec City on Tuesday that Trump is pulling Canada out of its lethargy and forcing its leaders to rethink the economy. Charest is now a member of Prime Minister Mark Carney's Council on Canada-U.S. Relations. He says Trump and his tariff war are forcing Canada to review its tax system, economy, and the way it carries out major projects. The ex-premier adds that Canada needs to reduce its dependence on the United States and expand into new markets. Charest suggested the country, under Carney's leadership, will accelerate big projects, rethink federalism, and redefine the country's role in the world. I'm from the school of thought that we'll thank Donald Trump in 20 years for shaking us up in Canada and bringing us out of our lethargy, he said Tuesday in a speech at a Quebec City hotel. It's high time we rethink our economy. Prime Minister Mark Carney said Canada is making progress on small tariff deals with the U.S. for key sectors after revealing he spoke by phone with U.S. President Donald Trump earlier in the week. He said he spoke with Trump at length on a wide range of issues, including trade, geopolitics, and employment. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney spoke with U.S. President Donald Trump on Thursday and had a productive and wide-ranging conversation on trade challenges and other issues, Carney's office said in a statement. The phone call, which comes at a time when Canada and the United States are locked in a trade war, was the first known conversation between the two leaders since June 30. Carney initiated the call, said a Canadian government source who requested anonymity because they were not authorized to speak to the media. The leaders, who also discussed the conflicts in Ukraine and Gaza, agreed to reconvene shortly, the statement added, but did not give any details. Carney's office said it could not comment when asked whether the two men intended to speak again or actually meet. In Washington, a Trump administration official said the two men had discussed trade. Canada has been holding talks with the United States on a new economic and security relationship for months, but the two sides are not close to a deal. The leaders discussed current trade challenges, opportunities, and shared priorities in a new economic and security relationship, the statement said. In late July, Trump signed an executive order increasing tariffs on Canadian goods to 35% from 25% on all products not covered by the U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade agreement. The White House cited what it said was Canada's failure to stop fentanyl smuggling and address U.S. concerns about trade barriers. Conservative Party leader Pierre Poilievre said on Friday that he was happy to hear that Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney got U.S. President Donald Trump on the phone, but it was yet another capitulation and climb down by Mark Carney. Poilievre criticized Carney for removing almost all tariffs on the U.S. without securing any concessions in return, stating his elbows have mysteriously gone missing and this call follows another concession. Today, the Prime Minister, Mark Carney, had a productive and wide-ranging conversation with the President of the United States, Donald J. Trump. The leaders discussed current trade challenges, opportunities, and shared priorities in a new economic and security relationship between Canada and the U.S. Canada will remove many retaliatory import tariffs on U.S. goods and intensify talks with the United States on striking a new trade and security relationship, Prime Minister Mark Carney said on Friday. Canadian tariffs on U.S. autos, steel, and aluminum will remain for now, he told a press conference. Carney noted that the United States had recently made clear that it would not impose tariffs on Canadian goods that were compliant with the three-nation U.S.-Mexico-Canada Free Trade Agreement, something he called a positive development. In this context and consistent with Canada's commitment to USMCA, I am announcing today that the Canadian government will now match the United States by removing all of Canada's tariffs on U.S. goods specifically covered under USMCA, he said. Canada and the U.S. have now re-established free trade for the vast majority of our goods, he added, reiterating that compared with its trading partners, Canadian exports were still subject overall to a low level of U.S. tariffs. Canada has been holding talks with the United States on a new economic and security relationship for months, but the two sides are not close to a deal. Canada and China are the only nations to strike back at the United States with counter tariffs, much to the irritation of the U.S. administration. Carney spoke to Donald Trump on Thursday. Asked whether the U.S. president had told him that lifting the tariffs would kickstart the talks, Carney responded, yes. Trump, when asked about Carney's decision to remove tariffs, called it a nice thing while addressing journalists in the Oval Office. "We are working on something. We want to be very good to Canada. I like Carney a lot," he said. Carney won an April election promising to stand up to Trump's tariffs, but since then has gradually taken a softer tone. Carney scrapped a proposed digital services tax in late June that U.S. companies strongly disliked, and in July dropped talk of further sanctions if the two sides could not reach a deal by August 1. He also held steady on tariffs on steel and aluminum products imported from the United States at 25% when Trump increased tariffs on steel and aluminum from Canada to 50%. Carney's predecessor as Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, imposed 25% tariffs on C-30 billion, $21 billion in goods imported annually from the United States on March 6 in response to Trump's initial duties. The C-30 billion was part of an overall retaliation plan to target C-155 billion worth of imported goods from the United States, though the remaining $125 billion has been delayed. However, despite concessions, a deal with the United States could be a far cry, a former government official said. Getting to a final deal isn't going to be easy. The list of U.S. demands is long, said Brian Clow, who was in charge of U.S. relations inside Trudeau's office for several years.
Carney said the time had come for a more moderate approach rather than continuing to take an aggressive stance. "Let's be clear, we have the best deal of anyone in the world right now," he said. "Nobody has a deal with the United States that they used to have." Carney said Canada will primarily focus on strategic sectors that are still facing tariffs, including steel, aluminum, autos, and lumber, as well as on the review of the free trade USMCA deal called CUSMA in Canada. The USMCA officially comes up for review in July 2026, 6 years after it entered force on July 1, 2020. Carney said the review is likely to start in the spring, but preparations will begin shortly. Business leaders have called on the government to focus on getting a solid deal under the USMCA Free Trade Agreement, as this pact has been critical in protecting Canadian companies and the economy from broader tariffs. While there is more work to be done to resolve tariffs in strategic sectors, Canada's priority must be the successful review and renewal of the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement, said Goldie Hyder, President and CEO of the Business Council of Canada. The news could be a political challenge for Carney, whose ruling Liberals only have a minority of seats in the House of Commons, elected chamber, and rely on opposition parties to survive votes of confidence. The leader of the Conservatives, the largest opposition party, this week accused Carney of taking too soft an approach with the United States. Canada-U.S. Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc met with U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick on Tuesday in Washington as Ottawa looks to find relief from President Donald Trump's tariffs on key Canadian sectors. LeBlanc's office described the meeting, which also included Canada's ambassador to the U.S., Kirsten Hillman, as lengthy and constructive. Carney's chief of staff, Marc-André Blanchard, is also in the U.S. Capitol this week. The meeting comes after Prime Minister Mark Carney announced last Friday that Canada will drop some retaliatory tariffs on U.S. products to match American tariff exemptions for goods covered under the Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement on Trade, called CUSMA. Canada imposed 25% tariffs on a long list of American goods, including oranges, alcohol, motorcycles, and cosmetics. Canada's CUSMA exemption for American imports will take effect on September 1st. LeBlanc has said Canada's counter tariffs were a significant point of contention with the Trump administration amid negotiations of a new economic and security relationship. Canada's counter tariffs on steel, aluminum, and automobiles will remain. The tariffs on automobiles generally align with the United States, but Canada's counter tariffs on steel and aluminum remain at 25%, despite the U.S. raising its rate to 50% in June. LeBlanc has said the goal of talks with the U.S. is a bilateral deal that lessens pressures of Trump's sectoral tariffs on industries like steel, aluminum, and automobiles ahead of an upcoming CUSMA review. Trump boosted tariffs on Canada to 35% at the start of August, with the White House saying the flow of fentanyl and retaliatory tariffs were behind the increase. Those duties are not
applied to goods compliant under CUSMA. Carney was in Latvia's capital on Tuesday, repeated that 85% of Canadian goods remain tariff-free, and Ottawa's focus is on the key areas being hammered by Trump's separate duties: steel, aluminum, automobiles, copper, and lumber. Those are the areas where immediately we are focused on improving the outcomes if we can, Carney said in Riga during a news conference with Latvian Prime Minister Evika Siliņa. And in order to do that, we will have to look at other areas where we can have win-win cooperation. LeBlanc has said he's talking to Americans about a package of stuff that can include investment opportunities in areas like defense and security, which could accompany tariff relief on Canadian sectors. Trump has appeared unwilling to back down on his global tariff regime. During a marathon cabinet meeting that played out in front of reporters for more than 3 hours on Tuesday, Trump repeatedly said his tariffs were bringing money into the federal coffers and reinvigorating domestic manufacturing. The president said factories are booming and said auto production will be thrilling in 2 years because manufacturers are building plants all over the country due to the tariffs. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney spoke with U.S. President Donald Trump on Thursday and had a productive and wide-ranging conversation on trade challenges and other issues, Carney's office said in a statement. The phone call, which comes at a time when Canada and the United States are locked in a trade war, was the first known conversation between the two leaders since June 30. Carney initiated the call, said a Canadian government source who requested anonymity because they were not authorized to speak to the media. The leaders, who also discussed the conflicts in Ukraine and Gaza, agreed to reconvene shortly, the statement added, but did not give any details. Carney's office said it could not comment when asked whether the two men intended to speak again or actually meet. In Washington, a Trump administration official said the two men had discussed trade. Canada has been holding talks with the United States on a new economic and security relationship for months, but the two sides are not close to a deal. The leaders discussed current trade challenges, opportunities, and shared priorities in a new economic and security relationship, the statement said. In late July, Trump signed an executive order increasing tariffs on Canadian goods to 35% from 25% on all products not covered by the U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade agreement. The White House cited what it said was Canada's failure to stop fentanyl smuggling and address U.S. concerns about trade barriers. Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc is said to meet with U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick in Washington this week after Ottawa announced it would be lifting some retaliatory tariffs. LeBlanc's office said he will travel to the United States Capitol on Tuesday. Prime Minister Mark Carney announced last Friday that Canada will drop some retaliatory tariffs on U.S. products to match American tariff exemptions for goods covered under the Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement on Trade called CUSMA.
Canada's counter-tariffs on steel, aluminum, and automobiles will remain. U.S. President Donald Trump on Friday called the decision to lift some duties nice, and the White House said it was long overdue. LeBlanc has said the retaliatory tariffs were a significant point of contention in negotiations ahead of President Donald Trump's move to boost duties on Canada to 35% earlier this month. Those duties are not applied to goods compliant under CISMA. The White House pointing to the flow of fentanyl and retaliatory tariffs as the reasoning behind the boosted levies. Canada imposed 25% tariffs on a long list of American goods in March, including oranges, alcohol, clothing and shoes, motorcycles, and cosmetics. Canada's CUSMA exemption for American imports will take effect on September 1. Ottawa's move to amend tariffs received a mixed response in Canada. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre said it was a representation of Carney's capitulation and climb down, while the Canadian Federation of Independent Business called it a step in the right direction. LeBlanc has said he's in constant communication with his American counterpart. He met with Lutnick on numerous occasions in Washington ahead of Trump's trade deal deadline of August 1. LeBlanc has said the goal is to negotiate a bilateral agreement that helps lessen the impact of Trump's separate tariffs: steel, aluminum, copper, lumber, and autos. Trump has appeared unwilling to change sectoral tariffs or to ease economy-wide duties even as countries strike a deal. On Monday, Trump said America is the most respected we have ever been, while talking about how much money has come in from duties. Dropping some of Canada's counter tariffs could also ease tensions ahead of a review of the Continental Trade Pact next year. Initial negotiations are likely to begin in the coming months. CUSMA is critical for Canada as Trump moves to realign global trade, allowing for a majority of Canadian goods to remain tariff-free. The Trilateral Trade Pact was negotiated during the first Trump administration to replace the North American Free Trade Agreement. The president in May said CUSMA was very effective, but also said he didn't know if it's necessary anymore.